when he separated and made the two lights to separate the day from the night.
Yeah.
The sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. And so we also see that in the 4th millennium, because one day is as 1,000 years with Yahweh. So on the 4th millennium, Yeshua, the light of the world, came into the world as firstborn of all creation, in the complete image and likeness of Elohim, because no man was ever born in the image and likeness of Elohim. Okay, so that's what makes him firstborn of all creation. Adam was made. Then Adam, Cain, and Hevel were born in the image of man because they'd corrupted themselves in the garden already. So the image and likeness of Elohim was already in a depraved state. So Yeshua comes born of a maiden in the perfect image and exact likeness and image of Elohim. Okay, so that's what makes him firstborn. Okay, not in time, but in type. And so he comes and he's firstborn. He now dies on the stake on the 4th day. He's in the heart of the grave, or whatever. So I'll just use Gregorian days for the sake of Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night. I explained it last night to them. Then it's Thursday day, Friday day, Saturday day. At sunset on Saturday, sunset on Sabbath begins the first day of the week.
Yeah.
And so he came out of his grave on sunset on Sabbath. And when he died on the 4th day of the week, the graves of many were opened, and the tombs just lay open. For 3 days and 3 nights, they lay there. And when Messiah rose 3 days and 3 nights later, at the end of Sabbath, because he's master of the Sabbath, which is also a prophetic shadow picture, at the end of the 7th millennium, when he destroys Satan and the beast and everything else, and the renewed heavens come, announcing clearly that he is the master of the rest. So therefore he raised himself at the end of the Sabbath, showing he's master of the Sabbath. Okay, and when he rose, those that were in the tombs came out and appeared to many. And every time I say this, I want you to picture the scene. Jerusalem was in chaos because of this one that was impaled, that made himself Elohim. For 3 days and 3 nights, those that followed him, only the 11 still clung to him, but many started saying, well, this, you know what happened. And suddenly he's risen. He appears only the next day to some, but those that rose after him start knocking on doors and saying, hello, I'm back. And when the woman came to the tomb, while it was still dark, so Yeshua did not rise on Sunday, because that is a sun worship system attributed to Tammuz, who was born in the winter solstice in December 25th. Yeshua was born in September, October, during the Feast of Sukkot. Okay? Or at the beginning of the Feast of Sukkot. And on the 8th day of Sukkot, he was circumcised. So what we see happening here is these people appeared, and when the woman came to the tomb, it was still dark, so it was not the day yet, and the stone had been rolled away, showing he's risen. And when they then saw him that day, he said, do not come to me, I've still got to go to the Father. Okay, why? Because we looked at that with the waving of the sheaf, which we spoke. Anybody who doesn't understand that, go look at the video or the notes of the waving, what it symbolizes, and from when we begin our counting, which we're busy in right now. Okay? And so we see something significant, and I just want to mention again, because it is that season where I want to equip you, although you already know it, but just refresh your memory, so you go out there to friends and family that you're calling out, because they're going to celebrate Easter soon. Okay? Now, when we look at the origin of that, it's all built around a sun worship system that has its roots traced to the great-grandson or grandson of Noah. Okay? Nimrod, who was a grandson of Ham. Okay? Now, Nimrod was a mighty warrior in the face of Yahweh, which means he was challenging his authority. It's not a compliment. It means he was a fighter, just as Cain was, not a tiller of the ground. Okay? Yeah. And it's time for us to till the soil of our hearts. So now here we see a picture of Nimrod, who built Babel. He's the one that built 10 cities. He built Babel, and they didn't want to go throughout the earth according to Yahweh's instructions to populate the earth. They wanted to build a tower for themselves and reach the heavens. Okay? Babel means confusion. because Yahweh came down that day and he confused the languages.
Yes.
Okay, Babylon, On is also the name for Ra. So Babylon means the confusion by, actually Babel means confusion by mixing. So the confusion by mixing of the worship of the sun, that's what Babylon represents for us. And the whore of Babylon is the system that promotes confused sun worship, which we are to come out of, because she's the whore. Okay, now, so Nimrod married his mother. How sick is that? Semiramis. Okay, now she started proclaiming and teaching through in a sense, a Jezebel type spirit that would be named and come later, but she would, an anti-Messiah spirit, proclaim that he is, like Pharaoh was the incarnate son, so is Nimrod. And when Nimrod died, she said he's gone to be the sun. And every equinox, they would have fertility worship practices where maidens would be prepared, virgins would be prepared to have sex on the altar. On these services, it was held in high regard to be a cult prostitute that was used in service of fertility worship before the face of all. Sounds sick, and that's why, and it is sick, because they would have sexual acts as worship to the sun. And these maidens would be impregnated on this equinox that happens at the March equinox. And so then the next equinox, not the next equinox, but the following year, those babies that would be born from those maidens, they would be around 3 months old, they would be sacrificed on this equinox altar, and they would take eggs as a sign of fertility and dip it in the blood of the infants as fertility worship. Because they were born to be killed for fertility worship. Okay. Now, Semiramis, also known as Ishtar, if you ask anybody from the East who's Ishtar, they know who Ishtar is. Easter, the many-breasted one. She's known as Sybil. She's known as Astarte in Greek, Sybil in Rome. Also, Cirque is one of the names from where we get circus. Okay, because circus, Cirque was believed in mythology to do was to mesmerize, hypnotize men and cause them to act like pigs and move around. And so she would entertain her followers by hypnotizing people and causing them to do acts of wild animals and pigs. And we kind of see a flow of where a lot of the elements of circus comes from. Okay, so because it's Cirque. And from that, even the Scottish name, even in the movies, kirk, you know, which is where we even get the word for church from the Old English, even Dutch, kirk, you know, and Captain Kirk, beam me up, Scotty, you know, that's where, you know, so we see the roots of all those things. And you say, oh, it sounds pedantic. Believe you me, our enemy is very crafty at causing a delusion to look to not cause you to see the truth through the delusion. Okay, so back to Semiramis. She also performed, because if Nimrod was the sun god, she was, by her own assumption and designation, the queen of the heavens. Okay, so as the queen of the heavens, she would also perform acts of sexual immorality on the altars. I'll rather say altars than slaughter place, because it's just the English wording. But anyway, so she got impregnated, and she said she was divinely impregnated by Nimrod, the rays of the sun. Okay, she had sexual acts with a cult prostitute, but she said she is the divine. So again, it's this picture of the maiden giving birth to the sun. Tammuz. And Tammuz was born because she went on the March equinox, and he was born in the winter solstice, which is around December 20 odd. They fixed the date to 25th later on in the Roman era, so that everybody would be keeping the same date, because the solstice obviously changes day, and it's normally 21st, but they fixed the date to December 25th. Now Tammuz was seen as now the incarnate Nimrod, the child of the sun, you know. And here you have now with the mother and the son, you have the typical Catholic image of mother-son, Mary worship. And you have the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and you got the mother interceding. Okay? And so here, this was now developed as a worship system, and Tammuz was then killed at 40 years old in a hunting accident by a wild pig. And she introduced a time of weeping for Tammuz. Okay, in Ezekiel, one of the abominations that Yahweh shows Ezekiel the prophet is how the women are weeping for Tammuz. So we see it in Ezekiel. It's not something, and when people read that, they go, oh, what's that? Because they don't know where this is coming from. And the corrupt worship that Israel was doing as an abominable thing in the eyes of Yahweh. Because they were weeping for Tammuz, because she introduced a time of mourning for 40 days. For every day of his life, they would mourn here, and they would deny themselves fleshly desires for 40 days, for every day in his afterlife, for the 40 years that he lived, so that it would intercede to give him blessing in the afterlife. Okay? And so this was a thing that was done continually. Then centuries later, in fact a couple of centuries after Messiah died, Constantine, the first emperor pope, in 325, he holds a council of Nicaea. He was a worshipper of Mithras. Mithras is the Roman version of Tammuz, the child of the sun. Okay, the Roman version of the Egyptian Ra. Okay, it's all sun worship in its various languages and forms. So Catholic means universal, and he sought a way to gain control over the universal masses of the world, and to do it through religion. And now he deemed a law that said anybody who is found to be keeping the Jewish Sabbath and feasts, nowhere are they Jewish Sabbath and feasts in the scriptures, but because Yahweh had divorced the house of Israel, and the only one he had not divorced, even though she had become an abominable, had gone into Babylonian captivity, come back, but still abominable, was Judah, the house of Judah, Jews. Yeah. So because they were still kind of keeping some form of appointed times and feasts, even when Yeshua was here, they were keeping the feasts. But it was labeled as the feasts of the Jews, but it's Yahweh's feasts. So he issued a decree that anybody that keeps the Jewish Sabbath, which is Yahweh's Sabbath, there's no other Sabbath, and anybody that keeps the Jewish feast would be killed. But he, yes?
That was more or less 350 years after Yeshua.
Let's say about 300 years.
Yeah, the time of Constantine.
Yes.
And was it considered as the Jews then, or was it the people that basically followed Yeshua? Because there is a separation. I mean, there is a different...
No, well, the connotation was that these feasts that anybody is following, even in the way, so even those that were following the way, these feasts that were described in this scrolls...
But we understand on the way the Jewish keep things and the way
Hebrew. Yeah, look, they're still the similar... Okay, now we know, according to Hilal's pre-calculated calendar, which came even further years later, but it was still the feasts that we're keeping. I mean, the Jews still keep Passover and Sukkot, and whether they keep it differently or different dates because of their calendars, it's still according to their interpretation of Leviticus. Okay, but because it became accustomed to those things, it was known as the Jewish feasts. Josephus, a historian, wrote a lot on the iniquities of the Jews, okay, of the Yehudim, because in fact that's really the only ones that were still being identified as a covenant people in those that are claiming Messiah had not yet come. Okay, so that's another rabbit hole to not look at yet.
It's still seen that way today.
Yes.
Because of how because of how Moshe is cast aside.
Yes. And it's still seen that, and that's why I'm saying it's nowhere ever in Scripture known as Jewish feasts. Because whenever we tell people, oh, we keep the Sabbath and the feasts of Scripture, oh, you're a Jew. Yeah. Because it's that, and that's the world's mindset. And that is because it was defined in print by the first emperor pope. He labeled it that and made it illegal to keep. Okay? Because he saw this narrow way and the good news thing. But now, how are we going to gain control over these? Because we still want to have our sun worship services. Yeah. So it's again a mixing that takes place, because you get the people through this. And remember, in those days, we were around, unless we were priests, we would not be able to read this.
Yes.
Okay? Keep the people from learning how to read so you can control them.
Yes, yeah.
And so we see this development over centuries and centuries and centuries, that what became proclaimed as the Elohim or the creator of the Bible, but this is how you worship him, and the Catholic Church announcing itself very clearly that they have authority to change the word. In fact, Rabbinic Judaism does the same thing. They use the scripture in Deuteronomy and they say the word is not across the sea, as if somebody said, who go fetch it? It's not up in the heavens, it's here with us, and therefore we can decide. Okay, and the Catholic Church also say they have the authority over the word, and they issued clear statements all through the centuries, and early also in the 20th century, in 1900 something, I can get the exact date. It's in some of my commentary notes. We've got quotes from all the different catechisms and legal documents from the Vatican that state, Cardinal Gibbons was one of the guys that stated that the Catholic Church has authority over the word, and they changed the Sabbath to Sunday.
That's right, yeah.
And the fact that people observe this prove their authority. Okay, and a lot of people say, but I'm not Catholic. I don't. Yeah, but you're keeping Sunday, so you're showing her authority, the authority of the whole.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, and this is something, I'm mentioning this now because this is very important for us, because as we read through Shemot 11 and 12 now, we see something unique about the Passover and Matzot, because that's the beginning of the feast. And obviously, if you start the feast right, you're going to count, you're going to get to Sukkot. Sukkot, you're going to get to Shavuot, and then you're going to get to Sukkot. So by keeping this feast shows the entrance to keeping everything. It's not that this is an isolated thing. So all of Yahweh's Sabbaths and feasts become a sign on our hand and as frontlets between our eyes. Okay. Now in Chazon, I think it's 14, it talks about the sign, those who take the mark of the beast. Revelation. Chazon, Revelation 14, it talks about that those who worshipping the beast in his image, or if anyone receives the mark of his name. So here we see a powerful thing again, is that there's the beast, anybody who worships the beast only has to have a mark on their hand or their forehead. Now that's metaphoric in type 2, because a hand speaks of our works, what we do. So when we have the working or the marking of Yahweh, it's because we obey his word. We do what his word says. We become doers of the word and not hearers only, as James writes to us, Yaakov. Okay, so between the frontlets of our eyes or on our forehead is our cognitive thinking process, our choices we make.
Yes.
We choose. We spoke earlier about choices. And if not making the right choices, you'll be handed over to the depravity of your choices. So to take the mark of the beast, if you choose to work on the Sabbath, you take the mark of the beast. Okay? You might not work on the Sabbath, say, I don't work on the Sabbath, but you choose to do your own things and not delight yourself in Yahweh. Or you choose cognitively, no, but Sunday is my Sabbath, or whatever day, because any day is a Sabbath, as some people do. That's again a sign on your forehead. Because some might say, but I don't work, I take it off, but I don't do what the word says, and delight in Yahweh's day.
Yeah.
So what we have is that which gives us to know that we work his word and we choose his word. We obey his word. That becomes a sign on our hand and forehead. That's what covers us and separates us in Yahweh as versus those who are marked by the beast and will be destroyed when his wrath comes. And I think this is very important for us to understand, because the blood that was put on the doorposts is a picture of us being covered in the blood of the Lamb, Yeshua Messiah, whose blood not only covers but cleanses, because the blood of bulls and goats could never satisfy, but was always only a shadow picture of his blood, as Hebrews writes for us. And so we also see how he took, you were to take the hyssop and apply the blood with the hyssop on the doorposts. Hyssop in Hebrew is ezov, and David cries out in Tehillah 51, cleanse me with hyssop that I may be clean. Purge me from my sin. Because it's a picture again of the application of Yeshua being dipped, or his blood and his body taking the punishment of sin for us and being applied to our lives. So that we are not only covered, but we're also cleansed. And that's what Yom Kippur celebrates. Covered, cleansed, and reunited. And so Passover, in many ways, becomes more of an individual choice. because the houses that put that, they are passed over. Okay? And so what we also see is, in actual fact, what Yahweh said is he would pass through the land. And it comes from the root Evrah, which is wrath, which also is from Avar, which is to pass over. And he'd pass through the land and destroy it. But when he would pass over the houses, seeing the blood, it's not the same root word. That's the root word Pesach, which is to pass over. So again, just as I said earlier, in the Hebrew understanding, it's a play on words. Eat or be eaten, again, the same thing. Be passed over or be passed over. Or passed through, you know. And so we have a powerful thing that we have in the Master, those who are in him and have applied his blood in tight by being immersed in him and partaking of the meal, partaking of his feasts, are covered in him. And we have that protection. I just want to, before we get to lunch, I just wanted to highlight 2 pictographs today. Okay? And because we're told that the Pesach is to be a remembrance for us. And it's a remembrance. We don't all go and slaughter and do all the things and apply blood to the doorposts. We don't do that. There's a remembrance meal that we have. There's certain things in this that says, and you shall celebrate this as a feast forever, and remember and tell your sons what this service means. Okay? So this word for remembrance is zikaron, which means to remember, but the root word to remember or is zachar. Okay? Now zachar looks like this in the ancient pictographic script. So you've got a Zion, a Kaf, and a Riesh. A Zion, which is a picture of a mattock. A mattock is a farming implement that kind of breaks the ground and it works the ground, you know. The Kaf is a picture of an open hand or palm. It also represents work or submit under, you know. And then the Riesh is a picture of a head of a man, which is top, chief, captain. So when we look at this in terms of understanding the Pesach and every other feast as a remembrance, but more specifically Pesach, in the matzot and the waving of the sheaf, because remember Yeshua said, don't say 4 months till the harvest is right, ask Yahweh for workers of the harvest. What we see is by the life, death and resurrection of Messiah, and by him as high priest taking those that rose after him as an offering, we can see that the harvest has been worked by the head. And that's the remembrance that we have. And so that's the root word to remember. But zikaron, which is the remembrance that we have, is just an additional couple of letters, which is so you got the Zion, the Kaf, the Riesh, and then you've got a Yot and a Nun. The Yot is a picture of a tent peg, which means add or secure. And then you've got the Nun. It's a Vav. Yes. Not a Yot. A Yot is an arm and a hand. Thank you. A Vav is a tent peg. And I should know that because I keep reminding you for tent pegs every year for Sukkot. Okay? So the tent peg is what secures or adds you. We also know that it's the peg or the nails that Yeshua took in his hands for us. Okay? And then you've got the seed or the nun, which is pictured as a seed, which speaks of life, or new life, or rebirth, or renewal, or continuance. So here we can see the harvest that's worked by the head is secured for us in his life, or it secures our life for us, or it secures the renewal of life because his word renews us. So how much more important do we understand why the keeping of the feasts and remembrance of them? Because even Shaul or Paul writes to the Corinthians and he says, as he writes, because Messiah says when he had the supper, and Shaul writes about this, that we have this remembrance meal. So Messiah at his supper that he had, the last meal, was not the Passover meal, it was a rehearsal meal, because he was not yet sacrificed as the lamb. But he said, as often as you do this, because I long to eat of this, and I will not drink of this cup until you see me in the rain. Okay, because the reason he said that is because he wasn't going to be there the next Pesach to drink with them. He wasn't even going to be there that Pesach to drink with them, you know. But he did say, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. Because in remembrance, when we rehearse, when we keep his Sabbaths, because again, the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, what does it begin with? Remember to keep the Sabbath. Because we forget. So his feasts and Sabbaths are there to remind us to remember the work that he's done and continues to do in us so that we can be a complete bride, you know. And so when we see this whole deliverance that took place and the firstborn being destroyed, and I mentioned earlier about the weeping and the wailing that was happening. I mean, not a house was overlooked that did not have the blood on. And I remind you again, there may have been some Hebrew or Israelite houses that did not apply the blood.
Yes, yeah.
So we must never think that I'm in and I'll never get destroyed. If we don't have his blood, in a sense, applied to our life, cleansing us through the washing of the word and being obedient to that each and every day, we may risk being outside and facing the wrath that is coming, you know. And so you can go look at the notes. We've spoken a lot on the Pesach and the sour wine that he took to his lips and said it's finished. So go read all that, because it should be fresh in your mind. I encourage you to go read through the notes. I just want to ask, has anybody got any questions around this or anything else that stands out from you as we've been looking at all these plagues and the destruction of everything that was worshipped, right down to the firstborn of everyone from Pharaoh to everyone that did not apply the blood? Yeah, okay, because why? And then in chapter 13, Yahweh says, separate every firstborn unto me. Why? Because he's just ransomed the firstborn. Blood for blood. He ransomed Mitzrayim for his bride. You know, it's blood for blood. So he put to death the firstborn, and he said, now, he ransomed Israel from Mitzrayim. Okay, so he killed all the firstborn in Mitzrayim so that the firstborn of Israel can be separated unto him. And therefore Yeshua, becoming the firstborn of all creation and the first fruits of the harvest and the firstborn among the dead and the firstborn of brothers, we realize that in him as his body, we are not only the firstborn that's been redeemed by Yahweh destroying the firstborn of the world, so to speak, we are now in him as his body, separated to Yahweh unto service. We are no longer our own. We belong to him. We've been bought at a price. Therefore, we shouldn't have pride and selfishness saying, I don't feel like doing it. Because if you confess that Yeshua is your Savior, then you've given up self-rights. Because now you are a bondservant forever. Which is a good thing. Remember, there was the firstborn that were put to death for those that didn't apply the blood on the doorpost. So then what comes out was a mixed multitude. Maybe people seeing what's happening, saying, we want to be with you. It's almost like a picture of Ruth. I'm not going there. Your Elohim will be my Elohim. It was a choice. We're not staying here. We're going with you. And then anything from that time on would be included. If they want to partake, any stranger that sojourns with you, if they can't partake of it unless, and when they get circumcised, which we know we've spoken at length about is immersion, is that they then become as native born. So yes, the first Pesach happened by those observing it, but then a mixed multitude of them saying, we want to go with you, came out.
So that could be one of them people who
Yes.
must stay for
Yes,
it,
could
right?
be.
Because it-
Yes.
we're out here. Okay.
So at Mount Sinai, it was Israel and Egyptians. There's 3 million people on Mount Sinai.
Yeah, at least between 2 and 3 million people that were there, you know. And you would hope that by seeing what Yahweh's done, that those mixed multitude would become as native born. Okay. Now, the instruction that was given for this huge 600,000 men on foot, plus a mixed multitude, millions of people coming out. You know, they had to leave Ramesses. They went from Ramesses to Sukkot. Okay, we've spoken, Sukkot means booths. Okay, and so here we see Ramesses means child of the sun. Wow. So it's a picture of us also. It was a lower city in Mitzrayim that was built by Hebrew slaves. Okay, and it was in the region of Goshen. So it was within the region where they stayed. But it was called, it means house of the sun. It was a very well respected place of Pharaoh that he got the Hebrew slaves to build. And they had to leave that. Teaches us many things. Sometimes you physically put effort into building a wrong thing. And you think, but I can't leave it now. I did so much work there. I went on missions. I did all the things I did. How can I leave? I plowed everything into it.
You gave it a name.
You even gave it a name. You know? And true taught ones of the master come out and have to let it go. And to dwell in booths is a picture again of us being sojourners. We're not held by things that keep us fixed.
Yeah.
You know, we're not held by that which enslaved us. And you think, well, our hands built this. Some people may even have physically built churches and systems and things and whatever. That shouldn't hold you and keep you from coming out and starting to dwell in booths and go where Yahweh tells you to go and be a sojourner with him, you know. And so we have to leave the child of the sun. That is Tammuz worship and all that's related to it. Mitzrayim literally means worshippers of Ra or sun god. And so we also understand something that it literally carries the concept behind that. In fact, Mitzrayim means to be besieged or in enslavement, or siege or enclosure or to confine. Mitzrayim is the plural of matzur, which actually means to enclose. And so these words, in one form or another, identify us or for us being enclosed or enslaved or besieged by that which cripples our ability to worship in spirit and in truth. So Mitzrayim, I'm correct. Mitzrayim itself doesn't mean child of the sun, that's Ramesses, but what it does identify is a place that enslaves you in that form. So we've been called out of darkness into his marvelous light, and this is something that we must celebrate continually. And knowing that in Messiah, who is firstborn, we are set apart and consecrated to him. And therefore, we should cause our own lives every day to commit our works to Yahweh, and he will establish our plans, you know. And we do these things as a remembrance, a continual remembrance of who he is. And each week, we have a remembrance service with the Sabbath, you know. And anybody who says, oh, I can't do it, I'll do it on my own, I don't need to fellowship, I don't need to connect. We've got people connecting with us. We've got family that connect with us over Twitch, that are gathering in tight with us. But there are some people in the world who say, I don't need to gather anywhere. That's still selfishness and pride. There's still a Ramesses that needs to get out.